When I think back to that evening, it all seemed so ordinary at first, just another night at my best friend's house. Daniel and I had known each other since middle school. Our bond built on countless shared jokes, late night study sessions, and a mutual trust that felt unshakable. His home had always been a second home to me. The familiarity of his kitchen, the laughter of his parents in the background, even the old couch that sagged in the middle, it all spoke of comfort. That night, though, the walls of his house carried something different, something I hadn't expected. Daniel had invited me to stay over, because the following morning we planned to leave early for a road trip with a group of friends. It wasn't unusual. Sleepovers at his place had been a regular thing over the years. I packed light, just a duffel bag with essentials, and as I rang the doorbell, I carried with me nothing but the expectation of another easy night filled with casual chatter and mindless gaming. What I hadn't expected was the door opening to reveal Michael, Daniel's older brother. I'd seen Michael plenty of times before, of course. He was 3 years older than us, already in college and often away. In my mind, he had always belonged to another world, older, more confident, carrying a kind of magnetic energy that made people turn their heads without him even trying. That night, he stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of mild curiosity and faint amusement, as if my arrival were more intriguing than he wanted to admit. "Hey, you're early," he said, his tone casual yet edged with something playful. I gave a polite smile, brushing off the flicker of unease in my stomach. Daniel invited me over. "He's expecting me." Michael nodded, stepping aside. "He's upstairs. Go on in." As I walked past him, I caught the faintest trace of cologne, something subtle yet intoxicating. It lingered in the air like an uninvited thought I couldn't quite push away. Upstairs, Daniel greeted me in his usual enthusiastic way, pulling me into his room that was cluttered with posters and game cases. We quickly fell into the rhythm of our friendship, banter about school, speculation about the trip, mindless laughter at inside jokes that never seemed to get old. With Daniel, there was no pretense, no need to gar myself. That was part of why I valued him so deeply. But beneath that comfort, my mind kept circling back to the image of Michael at the door. The way his eyes had lingered a second too long, the tilt of his smile. It was absurd, I told myself. I was here for Daniel, not to entertain thoughts about his brother. Still, the idea lodged itself in my mind, an itch that wouldn't go away. Dinner brought the three of us together at the table. Their parents were out for the evening, so it was just the brothers and me. Daniel, as always, dominated the conversation, filling the space with his energetic commentary. But Michael was quieter, occasionally throwing in a dry remark that made Daniel roll his eyes, but made me laugh. There was something deliberate in the way he spoke, as though every word was weighed and chosen. At one point, I looked up from my plate and caught Michael watching me. Not in the way you'd casually glance at someone seated across from you, but really watching, his gaze steady, almost searching. Heat crept into my face, and I quickly lowered my eyes, pretending to focus on my food. My pulse quickened in a way I couldn't explain. When Daniel excused himself to grab drinks from the fridge, Michael leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping just slightly. "You've been around this house for years," he said. "Feels like you're more family than guest." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them carried a weight that made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. I mumbled something about how Daniel and I had been inseparable since we were kids, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Yet, even as I did, I could feel his eyes on me, a quiet intensity that was difficult to ignore. Later, as the night wore on, Daniel and I retreated to his room, diving into video games until fatigue set in. Eventually, he stretched, declared he was exhausted, and collapsed into bed without another word. The room dimmed into quiet, the glow of the screen the only source of light. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing as he drifted off. My mind should have been calm, but instead it replayed moments from dinner, the smirk on Michael's face, the weight of his gaze. Somewhere beyond Daniel's door, the house seemed unusually alive, floorboards creaking, faint movements in the hallway. And in the stillness of the night, I couldn't shake the unsettling sense that I wasn't the only one awake. The house was quiet, save for the occasional groan of settling wood. Daniel's soft breathing filled the room, steady and unbothered. A reminder of the trust one was betraying simply by lying awake restless. I shifted under the blanket, telling myself to close my eyes, to push aside the thoughts circling in my head. But no matter how I tried, the memory of Michael's gaze at dinner refused to fade. Finally, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Daniel. My throat felt dry, and I told myself water was the only reason I padded silently into the hallway. The air felt cooler out there, tinged with the faint scent of detergent and Michael's cologne, still sharp in my senses from earlier. The kitchen light was already on. Michael stood by the counter, a glass in his hand. He looked up as though he'd been expecting me, though the corner of his mouth lifted in mock surprise. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I swallowed, keeping my tone neutral. "Just thirsty." He poured me a glass without asking, sliding it across the counter with a deliberate slowness. His eyes lingered on mine as I reached for it, fingers brushing against his. The contact was fleeting, but carried a jolt that coursed straight through me. Silence settled between us. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but charged as though the air itself was brimming with unspoken words. Michael leaned against the counter, studying me with a half-smile that felt both teasing and dangerous. "You've grown up," he said finally. Not the same kid trailing after Daniel anymore. The words landed heavier than they should have. I shifted under his gaze, the weight of his attention unsettling yet magnetic. "People change," I murmured, unsure of what else to say. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space. I could smell the warmth of his cologne now, stronger, wrapping around me like an invisible thread. "Some changes," he said quietly, "are worth noticing. I should have left. I should have laughed it off, taken my water back upstairs, and buried myself under the covers. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen, my heart hammering, caught between the instinct to retreat and the pull of something I couldn't name. Michael tilted his head, studying me as though testing boundaries. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and brushed a stray thread off my shirt. His fingers lingered longer than necessary, his touch light, but intentional. I inhaled sharply, the sound far too loud in the stillness of the kitchen. He smiled faintly, as though he'd heard everything I wasn't saying. "You don't have to be nervous," he murmured. But I was. Nervous, exhilarated, guilty. Every emotion tangled together, warring for dominance. Yet when he leaned in closer, so near that I could feel his breath against my cheek, I didn't step back. The kiss came like a spark on dry tinder, sudden, consuming, unstoppable. His lips pressed against mine, gentle at first, then deeper, hungrier. I should have pulled away. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that Daniel lay sleeping just upstairs, that this was betrayal in its purest form. And yet I leaned into it, surrendering to the rush that drowned out reason. Michael's hand found the back of my neck, drawing me closer, anchoring me in the moment. My own hands trembled, unsure where to rest, caught between resisting and giving in completely. The taste of him, the warmth, the forbidden thrill, it was intoxicating in a way that terrified me. When we finally broke apart, the silence returned, heavier now, thick with what had just transpired. I stared at him, breathless, my chest tight, with both exhilaration and dread. This can't happen," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Michael's expression softened, though his eyes still held that same dangerous glint. "I know," he said, "but sometimes knowing doesn't stop it." The truth of his words settled over me like a weight. We both knew the line had been crossed, that nothing about tonight would ever be undone. The kitchen felt smaller now, the house suddenly claustrophobic with secrets. Michael stepped back first, his composure intact, as though nothing had happened. "Get some sleep," he said quietly, almost tenderly. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and turned back toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, guilt already gnawing at the edges of my adrenaline. When I slipped back into Daniel's room, his steady breathing was unchanged, oblivious. He hadn't stirred, hadn't noticed a thing. I lay down beside him, heart still racing, lips tingling with the ghost of Michael's kiss. Sleep didn't come easily. Instead, I stared at the ceiling again, but now the shadows seemed darker, the silence louder. And as I lay there, I realized with a sinking certainty a line had been crossed and there was no going back. Morning came too quickly. Sunlight crept through the blinds of Daniel's room, washing over the cluttered posters and tangled game controllers scattered across the floor. His alarm buzzed faintly before he silenced it with a groggy hand. Beside him, I pretended to stir naturally, though I had barely slept. My body had been still, but my mind hadn't stopped moving all night. Daniel stretched, yawning loudly. "Man, we stayed up way too late," he mumbled, shoving at my shoulder playfully. "Hope you're ready for tomorrow." I forced a laugh, trying to match his casual energy. Inside, guilt pressed down on me like a physical weight. His smile, so easy and unguarded, only made it worse. He had no idea that, while he dreamed peacefully, I had been downstairs betraying the very trust that bound us together. When we finally shuffled into the kitchen for breakfast, the tension became unbearable. Michael was already there, leaning casually against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. His expression was calm, unreadable, but when his eyes met mine, a flicker passed between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the night before. Daniel, oblivious, clattered bowls onto the table and launched into his usual chatter about our road trip plans. His voice filled the room, covering the silence I struggled to maintain. I couldn't look directly at Michael, but I felt him watching me in brief intervals, each glance sharp enough to make my chest tighten. At one point, Daniel left the kitchen to grab his phone from upstairs. The moment his footsteps faded, the air shifted. Michael set his mug down slowly, his gaze locking with mine. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to remind me of what we'd shared. I nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Yeah, fine." The word felt like a lie the moment it left my lips. Nothing was fine. My thoughts were tangled between desire and dread, the memory of his kiss still vivid against the sharp edge of betrayal. When Daniel returned, the spell broke. Michael turned away smoothly, resuming his calm facade as though nothing at all had happened. The ease with which he hid it unsettled me even more. The rest of the day blurred. We packed, we joked, we planned, but beneath every word, I carried the weight of a secret I couldn't share. Daniel trusted me completely. That trust had always been the foundation of our friendship. Yet now, every laugh I gave, every nod of agreement, felt like a betrayal hidden in plain sight. By evening, as I prepared to leave, Michael passed me in the hallway. For a brief second, his hand brushed mine, deliberate and quick, hidden from Daniel's view. My pulse spiked, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Last night doesn't have to mean anything," he said, "unless you want it to." The words lingered, their ambiguity both a comfort and a torment. I couldn't answer, not here, not with Daniel only a few feet away. So I simply nodded and stepped outside, my bag slung over my shoulder, my heart heavier than when I'd arrived. On the ride home, Daniel filled the car with music, humming along and tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching the scenery blur past, lost in thought. Every note of the song felt distant, muted beneath the storm inside me. That night replayed in my mind over and over, the taste of the kiss, the warmth of Michael's hand, the rush of adrenaline. Yet alongside it came Daniel's easy laughter, his unwavering trust, and the knowledge that I had broken something sacred. Lying in bed later, I realized the truth. Infidelity isn't always about love or even about lust. Sometimes it's about crossing a line you swore you never would, about giving into a moment that leaves you both exhilarated and hollow. I hadn't told Daniel. I didn't know if I ever would. Some secrets, once spoken, could never be taken back. But deep down, I knew this. The memory of that night would never fade. It would linger like a shadow between us, silent and invisible, yet always there. And though Daniel might never know the details, I would carry the weight of it every time I looked into his trusting eyes. Some temptations burn only for a moment, but the scars they leave, those remain. The weeks after that night were marked by a fragile quiet, as though nothing had changed. On the surface, life continued its familiar rhythm: classes, weekend hangouts with Daniel, long stretches of ordinary conversation. But underneath, something pulsed. Every time I entered Daniel's house, I felt it, the invisible thread that bound me to Michael, a reminder of a secret too dangerous to name. Michael seemed to sense it too. He never pushed, never cornered me, but his presence had shifted. When we crossed paths, his gaze lingered longer than it should have. A simple hello carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Daniel, ever trusting, noticed nothing. He remained the same friend he had always been, open, unguarded, generous. And that made the silence harder to bear. One Saturday evening, Daniel invited me over to plan for another trip. I agreed too quickly, already aware of what I was really walking into. When I arrived, the house felt charged. Daniel greeted me with his usual grin, dragging me upstairs to go through lists of supplies. We sprawled across his bed, laughing at our disorganized notes, the easy comfort of our friendship masking the storm beneath my skin. It wasn't until Daniel left the room to answer a call that the quiet returned. The moment his footsteps faded, I felt it, the pull. Michael was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning casually against the wall as though he had been waiting. Our eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow. He didn't speak, but his expression said enough. I excused myself under the pretense of grabbing water, though we both knew better. In the kitchen, the tension tightened. Michael stood close, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. His voice was low, steady. "You've been avoiding me." "I had to," I whispered, though the conviction in my words faltered. "Had to," he repeated as if testing the phrase. "But you came back." The truth of that stung. I could have said no to Daniel's invitation. I could have chosen distance. Instead, I was here, standing inches from the very danger I pretended to resist. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. My heart thudded, torn between fleeing and surrendering. The memory of our kiss haunted me, sharper now in his nearness. "This isn't fair to Daniel," I muttered, more to myself than to him. Michael's expression softened, though his eyes never lost their intensity. "Maybe not, but is it fair to deny what you feel?" The words wrapped around me, dangerous and tempting. My silence betrayed me. I didn't answer, but I didn't move away either. From upstairs, Daniel's voice called my name, casual and unsuspecting. The sound jolted me back to reality, shattering the fragile moment. I stepped back quickly, the space between us widening, though the current still hummed in the air. Michael's lips curved into a faint smile, part challenge, part promise. "We'll talk later," he murmured. By the time Daniel reappeared, I was seated at the table with a bottle of water, feigning normalcy. He launched back into conversation without hesitation, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. That night, as I lay in Daniel's room again, the same cycle repeated. His easy laughter, his trust, his presence beside me. But beyond the door, I knew Michael was awake too, carrying the same restless thoughts. The house no longer felt like a place of comfort. It had become a stage for a game I wasn't sure I could keep playing, a game where one wrong step could cost me the very friendship I valued most. And as sleep eluded me, one truth crystallized in the darkness: temptation hadn't ended that night in the kitchen. It had only just begun.